shadow clung to her, a phantom weight heavier than any burden she had ever known, even as the distant mountains called to her soul, promising freedom from a cruel, echoing laughter that pursued her across the vast, indifferent plains. She carried the quiet dignity of her ancestors, a resilience forged in ancient lands, yet the whispers, the snickers, the knowing glances about her form had etched themselves deep into her spirit, a constant, dull ache. They saw only the breadth of her shoulders, the sturdy curve of her frame, a testament to strength and life, but others saw only something to deride, something that did not fit their narrow, brittle molds of what a woman should be. Her journey westward, a desperate gamble born of necessity, was not merely miles traversed but a journey through the labyrinth of her own insecurities, a perilous venture into the unknown, driven by the stark realities of a world that offered little quarter to those who stood outside its unforgiving expectations. She sought not love, not passion, but simply a haven, a place where her presence might be accepted, where the relentless mockery would cease to be the soundtrack of her existence. This was a narrative woven from the raw threads of survival and the yearning for simple, unadorned peace. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a ceaseless, mournful lament, whispered secrets through the sagebrush as Aara stepped off the dust-choked stagecoach, her gaze sweeping across the unfamiliar, desolate town of Blackwood. Its buildings, splintered and leaning, seemed to cower beneath the vast, indifferent sky, mirroring the hollowness that had settled deep within her chest. The journey had been a crucible, each mile a silent prayer against the rising tide of doubt, against the gnawing certainty that her escape from the Navajo nation, from the suffocating judgment of her own community, was merely a leap from one cage into another. Memories, sharp as obsidian shards, flickered at the edges of her vision, the dismissive wave of a hand, the snickering behind cupped palms when she dared to speak of her hopes, the way certain boys averted their eyes, as if her very presence was an affront. She was told she was too much, too big, too strong, too much woman for any man to handle, too much of everything for a world that craved delicate fragility. The mail-order advertisement, glimpsed in a tattered newspaper, had promised a new beginning, a man who sought a strong, capable wife for the untamed frontier, a place where perhaps her physical prowess would be a virtue, not a flaw. Yet the same cruel whispers that haunted her homeland had followed her, carried on the very wind that now tugged at her shawl, a constant reminder of the societal measuring stick against which she perpetually fell short. Her heart, a weary drum, beat a slow, anxious rhythm against her ribs as she awaited the man who had promised her a future, a man whose face she had only seen in a crudely drawn sketch, a man whose acceptance was her only hope of a life beyond the shadow of scorn. The dust swirled around her worn boots, a metaphor for the shifting, uncertain ground beneath her feet, a testament to the precariousness of her existence in this new, unforgiving landscape. The air in Blackwood hung thick with the scent of pine and something else, the stale, bitter odor of disappointment. Aara stood isolated on the boardwalk, a lone, stark silhouette against the backdrop of the rough-hewn buildings. The townspeople, a cluster of sun-scorched faces and suspicious eyes, emerged from the shadows of the general store and saloon, their murmurs a low, venomous hum that reached her even from a distance. She felt their gazes like physical blows, tracing the outlines of her sturdy frame, their expressions a familiar mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled scorn. This was the same look she had endured for years, the judgmental appraisal that instantly dismissed her worth based on a superficial assessment. Her breath hitched, a knot tightening in her throat, as she saw him, Mr. Abernathy, the man she was contracted to marry, standing rigidly by the mercantile, his face contorted in an expression of undisguised shock and revulsion. He was a small man, wiry and brittle, and his eyes, when they met hers, held no warmth, only a stark, immediate rejection. His lips, thin and pale, moved, but the words were swallowed by the wind, yet their meaning was clear, universally understood. He looked at her, then looked away as if unable to bear the sight, a gesture that sliced deeper than any shouted insult. The few townsfolk who had gathered let out small, derisive chuckles, their amusement echoing the very mockery she had sought to escape. This was it then. The crushing weight of her fears realized. She had traveled across a continent only to face the same unwavering judgment, the same narrow-minded cruelty that had driven her from her ancestral lands. The humiliation washed over her, a hot, stinging tide, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in the harsh, indifferent light of the afternoon sun. She was a failure, rejected, alone, a monumental mistake in a world that had no place for her. The silence that followed his visible disdain was deafening, a vacuum where her hopes had once briefly dared to bloom. The rejection was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak woven from shame and despair, settling upon Aara's shoulders with an unbearable weight. Mr. Abernathy, after a few whispered words with the stagecoach driver and a hurried, dismissive glance in her direction, disappeared into the mercantile, leaving her stranded, a monument to unwantedness, beneath the unforgiving scrutiny of Blackwood's inhabitants. Her heart, a bruised thing, quivered, threatening to shatter. She had placed all her desperate, fragile hopes upon this unknown man, upon this desolate promise of a new beginning, only to have them crushed under the heel of his casual disdain. The townspeople, their eyes like needles, pricked at her composure, but she stood tall, a defiant if trembling silhouette against the dusty street. To flee would be to confirm their silent mockery, to admit defeat. But where would she go? The vastness of the land stretched out behind her, a merciless reminder of the distance she had traveled, the impossibility of retreat. A single tear, hot and defiant, traced a path through the dust on her cheek, a stark testament to the pain she held captive within. It was in this raw, vulnerable moment, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the street, that a presence shifted at the edge of her periphery. He emerged from the deeper shadows near the saloon, a man of rough-hewn strength, his shoulders broad as a giant's, his frame towering above the others. He moved with the quiet grace of a forest beast, his gaze, unlike the others, not sharp or mocking, but steady, unsettlingly direct. Silas the lumberjack. His eyes, the color of deep forest moss, held an unreadable depth as he observed her, not with pity or scorn, but with an intensity that seemed to peel away the layers of dust and despair. Looking beyond the surface, he simply watched, a silent, grounded sentinel in a world that had just turned its back on her. Silas moved then, his boots crunching softly on the loose gravel, each step deliberate, unhurried, cutting through the taut silence that had fallen over the street. The townspeople, their gossiping momentarily suspended, watched him with a mixture of apprehension and deference. He was an enigma, a man of the woods, his presence a stark contrast to their petty concerns. He stopped a few feet from Aara, his shadow falling over her, a momentary, unexpected shield. His gaze was still upon her, unwavering, searching. There was no pity there, only a profound, almost primal observation. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the tension to coil and stretch, filling the space between them. When his voice finally broke the silence, it was a low rumble, like distant thunder, grounded and resonant, carrying the scent of pine and earth. "They see what they want to see," he said, his words directed not at her but to the air between them, a quiet pronouncement that seemed to absorb the venomous stares of the onlookers. His eyes, however, remained fixed on hers, a silent invitation to look deeper, to see beyond the superficial. "But they don't see the strength," he continued, his voice rough but kind, a surprising tenderness woven into its timbre. "They don't see the spirit." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly, resting on her face, then her hands, strong and capable. A small, almost imperceptible shake of his head followed, as if in dismissal of the town's ignorance. "You're perfect," he finally uttered, the word hanging in the air, blunt and unexpected, yet imbued with an astonishing weight of sincerity. It wasn't a romantic declaration, not in the way the town understood love, but a simple, profound statement of recognition, a challenge to the world's narrow definition of worth. It was a single precious stone dropped into the churning waters of her despair, sending ripples of disbelief through her. The word was a foreign melody, utterly alien to the symphony of mockery that had defined her life. It was a truth she had never dared to contemplate, spoken by a man who seemed to see her with eyes unclouded by prejudice, a man who saw not what she was not, but profoundly, beautifully what she was. The word perfect echoed in the hollow chambers of Aara's mind, a fragile, exquisite sound that stood in stark opposition to every cruel epithet she had ever endured. It was a strange balm, a fleeting reprieve from the constant internal flinching. She watched Silas, this giant of a man who seemed to belong more to the ancient forests than to this dusty, judgmental town. His declaration, so unexpected and so devoid of the romantic veneer she had grown accustomed to seeing in stories, held an honesty that sliced through the pretense of her situation. It was not a judgment, but an observation, a simple, profound recognition of her innate worth. The townspeople, momentarily stunned by his audacity, began to stir, their whispers resuming, tinged now with a new kind of speculation and unease. Silas, seemingly oblivious to their renewed scrutiny, merely offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "There's a cabin down by the river," he said, his gaze sweeping over the fading light. "Empty. You'd be safe there for now." His offer was not charitable, nor was it pity. It was a pragmatic statement, a recognition of her immediate need, and an unspoken assumption of her capability to survive. He turned then, his broad back a silent assertion of his commitment to her, and began to walk away, back towards the deeper shadows from which he had emerged. Aara, rooted to the spot, felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in years, a cautious, tentative spark of hope. This was not the fairy tale ending, not the knight in shining armor, but something far more grounded, far more real. It was an acknowledgement that her strength, her very being, held a value beyond the superficial, a truth whispered by a man who saw with different eyes. The immediate offer of shelter, unburdened by conditions, was a stark contrast to the expectations and obligations that had driven her to this desolate place, a sudden, unexpected anchor in her storm-tossed existence. The world, for a fleeting moment, felt less hostile, less determined to break her spirit. Their unconventional bond, forged in the crucible of public scorn and a shared understanding of solitude, began to unfold with the measured pace of the seasons. Aara moved into the small, rustic cabin, its rough-hewn walls echoing the quietude of her own spirit. Silas, true to his nature, was a man of few words. His presence felt more than heard. He brought her provisions, left firewood stacked neatly by the door, and sometimes a piece of fresh-caught game. Their conversations were sparse, built on necessity and observation, yet each word held a weight, a subtext that spoke volumes. He never spoke of her size, never referenced the mockery, treating her with a simple, unwavering respect that was more profound than any grand declaration. She, in turn, observed him, this solitary lumberjack who seemed to commune with the ancient trees more than with men. She noticed the calluses on his hands, the deep lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, the quiet strength that hummed beneath his reserved exterior. He carried a certain sadness in his gaze, a profound weariness that mirrored her own, hinting at a past that had carved its own bitter lessons into his soul. The town, of course, continued its whispers. Their presence, two outcasts drawn together by the threads of rejection, fueled their gossip, their judgmental eyes following Aara whenever she ventured into Blackwood for supplies. But their barbs, once so potent, now seemed to glance off her, blunted by Silas's quiet acceptance. His unwavering gaze, which saw beyond the superficial, had begun to build a shield around her, a sense of self-worth that had been dormant for too long. She learned about his relentless work, the brutal demands of felling timber, the isolation he embraced, yet found a shared quiet comfort in their unspoken understanding. There was a subtle irony in their situation. The man who said she was perfect was himself an enigma, a loner, perhaps as flawed and complex as she was, bound together by the very judgment that had sought to separate them. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a mail-order bride, but as a person, and in that gaze she began to see herself anew. The bond between Aara and Silas deepened, a quiet, tenacious root-seeking purchase in the rocky soil of their shared solitude. Aara, now observing him more closely, began to piece together the fragments of his existence. He was a creature of habit, his days dictated by the rhythm of the forest, the rhythmic swing of his axe echoing through the valleys. She saw the profound respect he held for the towering pines, a reverence that bordered on the spiritual, as if he understood the language of their ancient whispers. There was a scar on his left forearm, a jagged line that hinted at a past incident, a moment of peril, or perhaps a painful confrontation. He rarely spoke of his origins, of the life he led before coming to Blackwood, but his eyes, when he thought himself unobserved, held a distant, almost mournful quality, suggesting a loneliness that ran deeper than simple preference. He had been an outsider long before her arrival, his solitary nature and immense strength setting him apart from the townsfolk, who viewed him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. It was a common thread between them, this status as an anomaly in a world that craved conformity. She began to see the quiet flaw within him, not a moral failing, but a profound reluctance to connect, a protective shell built from past hurt. Perhaps he too had known rejection, though not for his physical form, but for something less tangible, something that drove him to the silent embrace of the wilderness. This shared understanding, unspoken yet deeply felt, formed the bedrock of their evolving relationship. The revelation was not dramatic, but a gradual unfolding, like a slow sunrise over the rugged mountains, revealing the hidden contours of a man who was far more than a simple lumberjack. Their quiet meals together, the infrequent exchanges of necessities, became rituals imbued with an unspoken language of care and acknowledgement, each moment a subtle yet clear scene transition from mere acquaintance to something akin to quiet companionship. He saw her, and she in turn began to truly see him, past the formidable exterior, to the lonely yet resilient spirit within. The fragile peace they had cultivated was a temporary truce, easily shattered by the persistent encroachment of the world outside their secluded haven. The whispers of the town, always present, began to escalate, turning from idle gossip into a more pointed, insidious form of prejudice. The presence of a Navajo woman living unattached, and worse, seemingly protected by the formidable Silas, was an affront to their rigid social order. Children, emboldened by their parents' veiled scorn, began to shout epithets when Aara ventured into town, their innocent voices echoing the ugliness of their elders. A local merchant, wary of Silas but emboldened by the communal disapproval, attempted to overcharge her for supplies, a small act of aggression that was a ripple before a wave. The tension was palpable, a growing pressure in the air, a storm gathering on the horizon. Aara felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest, the phantom weight of past ridicule threatening to reassert its hold. She questioned Silas's unspoken protection, wondering if her presence was inviting more trouble into his already solitary life. "They want us gone," she stated plainly one evening, her voice devoid of emotion, but her eyes betraying the deep-seated weariness. Silas, who had been honing his axe by the firelight, merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the blade, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. He had faced the wilderness, the untamed elements, but the collective malice of humanity was a different kind of beast. The moral ambiguity of their position was stark. They sought only peace, yet their very existence, outside the prescribed norms, was perceived as a threat. The open loops of the town's animosity were tightening, threatening to ensnare them both. The quiet strength that defined them was now being tested, a trial by fire. There was an unspoken confrontation brewing, a sense of impending climax where their defiance would be met with an unforgiving response, pushing them to a point of no return. The storm broke with a fury as raw and untamed as the wilderness itself. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a series of calculated provocations that culminated in a harrowing confrontation. One frigid afternoon, a small group of the town's men, led by Mr. Abernathy's bitter younger brother, descended upon Silas's timber stand, attempting to claim a portion of his felled logs. It was a blatant act of theft, a calculated insult designed to provoke. Silas, his axe still wet with sap, stood before them, a towering, silent sentinel, his eyes burning with a dangerous intensity. But before the first blow could be struck, Aara appeared, not from behind him, but alongside him, her presence a powerful, unexpected assertion. She carried no weapon, only the unyielding strength of her conviction, her gaze meeting the men's with a fire they had not anticipated. Her voice, usually soft, now resonated with a deep, authoritative timbre, echoing the ancient power of her ancestors. "These are his," she declared, her words cutting through the tense air. "And he is mine." The irony was sharp, a subtle blade. The woman once mocked for her size now stood as a formidable, unwavering bulwark. Her simple declaration, a moment of profound emotional revelation, redefined their relationship, not as a contract, but as a mutual, defiant bond. The men, momentarily taken aback by her unexpected courage and the unwavering unity of the two outcasts, hesitated. It was then that the true pivotal emotional climax occurred, not in a grand fight, but in the collective realization that they were no longer two isolated figures, but a united force. Silas, his gaze softening as he looked at her, understood the depth of her statement, the immense trust she had placed in him, and the fierce loyalty she offered. He reached out, his calloused hand briefly but firmly covering hers, a silent, powerful affirmation of their shared defiance. The men, facing an unyielding front, grumbled, their bravado deflating, and slowly retreated, defeated not by force, but by the quiet, unwavering strength of their unity, a testament to a bond forged in adversity. The dust settled, literally and metaphorically, on Blackwood, leaving behind a profound stillness. The confrontation at the timber stand, though not a violent one, had been a turning point, a powerful demonstration that Silas and Aara were no longer easily swayed or dismissed. The town's open hostility subsided, replaced by a grudging, wary respect. The whispers still lingered, a faint echo of past judgments, but they held less power, less venom. Aara continued her solitary life in the cabin, but now a subtle shift had occurred within her. The mocking echoes had quieted, replaced by the steady beat of her own worth, affirmed by Silas's unwavering gaze and her own defiance. She had found a ground to stand on, not merely in the physical cabin, but within herself, a resilience rooted in self-acceptance. Their relationship, while unconventional, continued to deepen, founded on shared quiet and an understanding that transcended words. It was not a conventional love story, not a grand romance, but a slow, burning ember of companionship and mutual respect, built on the foundations of shared hardship and an unspoken pledge to stand by one another. There would be no grand declarations, no flowery promises. Their bond was etched in the practicalities of shared silence, the unspoken support in a harsh world, the unwavering presence of one another. The resolution was not a picture of perfect harmony, for life on the frontier remained unforgiving, and the prejudices of humanity an enduring shadow. But they had carved out a place, not just in the wilderness, but in each other's lives, a sanctuary built from quiet understanding and profound acceptance. The woman once mocked for her size had found a world where her strength was valued, and a man who, seeing beyond the superficial, had simply called her perfect. And in that simple, grounded truth lay the deepest, most enduring form of belonging. The sun, setting over the distant mountains, cast long, intertwining shadows of two figures, no longer isolated, but standing together against the vast, indifferent expanse, their future an open loop, yet filled with the quiet hope of shared resilience.